It was around this time last year that I made a video about the Buffalo Bills going into the 2021 season. And a lot of people hated that video because I said the Buffalo Bills were just not going to have the win totals that I think I saw a lot of people around the league thought they were going to get. I saw people saying they were going to get upwards of 13, 14 wins in a season. And look, in a 16-week season, that was already tough. In a 17-week season, not only does it become harder to win 13 to 14 games, it becomes harder to just be a very good team in general. You look around the league last year, there weren't as many 10-win teams around the league as I think a lot of people would have expected going into a season where we were playing more games than ever before. And for the Buffalo Bills, even though they had a season where they did not win the amount of games that I think a lot of people thought they could, they still were one of the best teams in the league and only had a 6-point loss in the divisional round against the Kansas City Chiefs to end the season. All in all, the season kind of got off to a rocky start through the first 11 weeks of the season. They had wins against some below average teams like the Texans, the Dolphins, the Washington football team, another win against the Dolphins, a win in New York against the Jets. You compare that to some of the losses that they had early in the season last year. They lost the very first game of the year against the Steelers, lost in Jacksonville 6-9 last year, and then lost to the Indianapolis Colts 15-41 in that Week 11 matchup at home. I think a lot of the things that I probably said in last year's video about the Buffalo Bills was that they don't have any semblance of a running game that is good and complementary to Josh Allen. Now, I also said that the Buffalo Bills were practically built to beat the Kansas City Chiefs and go shot for shot with Josh Allen against Patrick Mahomes. Even with that being said, I think the problem of not having a running back to rely on heavily was an issue for this team. Now, Devin Singletary, it was actually a surprise to me when I just checked his stats, ran for over 800 yards last year. And I think Devin Singletary has become a very forgotten piece of the Buffalo Bills, and to have 800 yards and be a forgotten guy for that team, that speaks to his talent and his ability as a running back. And I think going into this year, it's going to be a year where we sort of expect some things out of Devin Singletary, and I'm not sure with what they did in the offseason in terms of adding other skill position players, we're actually going to see Devin Singletary get to where a lot of people think he's going to be as a player. So let's start right there with the Buffalo Bills and talk about their offseason. I'm going to start with the offensive side of the ball. What they added in the offseason this year, I'm just going to talk about free agency first, and then I'll talk about the draft with both the offense and defense. But offensively, I mean, look, you add some very decent offensive line depth with names like Roger Saffold, David Quessenberry, Craig Van Roten. They added some really good names. Greg Manns as well, the center who came over from Miami this year. And then you talk about the skill position players they added. A 27-year-old O.J. Howard to play tight end. A 28-year-old Jamison Crowder to play wide receiver. Tavon Austin, who, I mean, every stop along the way, Tavon Austin has been able to do something for every franchise he's played for. He's not going to be a number 1, number 2, or even a number 3 option in this offense, but he's going to be somebody that could get the ball 2 or 3 times a game and have a moment where it looks like Tavon Austin is the most athletic player on the field. And the only guy of notability that they lost during the offseason this year was Mitchell Trubisky, who went and signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Outside of that, Buffalo really did not lose a lot on the offensive side of the ball. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the defense. The defense, they actually did lose a lot. And when I say a lot, they lost a lot of their defensive line depth and a lot of their main guys in the pass rush and run stuffing game. Harrison Phillips, who, I don't know if you know who Harrison Phillips is, but look him up. He literally looks exactly like Kyle Williams, plays the exact same position, pretty much does the exact same thing as Kyle Williams. And I was really expecting that there would be no way that Harrison Phillips would leave the Buffalo Bills. Lo and behold, he ends up going to Minnesota on a 3-year, $20 million deal. Levi Wallace, the 26-year-old corner, went to Pittsburgh. Mario Addison, who was the number 1 sack producer for this defense. I know it seems crazy that it was Mario Addison with 7 sacks who led the entire team. But, you know, it's what happened. He left and went to Houston. Vernon Butler went to Las Vegas. Efe Adoba, or Abada, I'm not exactly sure how to say his name. He went to Washington. Jerry Hughes left. He went to Houston as well. The only real name that they supplemented the defense with after all of those losses, and it's a very good name to add, is Von Miller on a 6-year, $120 million deal. Now, I'm not exactly sure if you want to be paying 38-year-old Von Miller $20 million a year, but they do have a potential out after 3 years in this contract, which more than likely is going to end up happening. They signed Tim Settle from the Washington football team, 24-year-old defensive tackle. Daquan Jones came over from Carolina. Jordan Phillips came over from Arizona. Outside of that, that's pretty much it for the transactions during free agency for this team. Now, this is something I try to remember to talk about, but there also will be not really the addition, but the comeback of Tre'Davious White this year, who tore his ACL somewhat halfway through the year last year. Getting him back is going to be a major piece for this Buffalo Bills defense, and he, up until his injury last year, in my opinion, was one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL and was one of the best guys at covering a number one receiver and taking him out of the game as best as he could. Let's go ahead and talk about the draft for the Buffalo Bills this year. They drafted Kaiir Elam with the number 23 overall pick out of Florida, a cornerback. It's a position that is of need for the Buffalo Bills, and it's a position where hopefully alongside Tre'Davious White, he can learn a few things. He can become that great number 2 corner that every single team in the NFL needs to have if they want to have a great defense. They got James Cook out of Georgia. Just another reason, like I said earlier, as to why I am not so sure we're going to see Devin Singletary get to the point that a lot of us think he could get to. Khalil Shakur, the wide receiver out of Boise State with the number 148 overall pick. Really not a lot of names in the draft this year for Buffalo. And honestly, that's kind of how this team is built, is not really to build through the draft right now. They've built through the draft the last 4 or 5 seasons. It's time for them to kind of get some names on this roster and make moves for a Super Bowl. I think the biggest loss that this team is going to go through this year, and the biggest loss that they're going to have to figure out a way around and figure out a way to get through, is the loss of Brian Daboll, the former offensive coordinator for this team, who went and took the job with the New York Giants as the head coach. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Brian Daboll going to New York is going to turn Daniel Jones into Josh Allen. What I'm going to tell you is Josh Allen losing Brian Daboll as offensive coordinator is going to be a move that hurts Josh Allen and the production of this offense. Brian Daboll should have had a job before last year, if I'm being honest with you. He should have had a job probably 2 years ago. When you compare some of the other offensive and defensive coordinators who have gotten head coaching jobs in the NFL the last few years, Brian Daboll not having a job alongside Eric Bieniemy is one of the most confusing things I think I've seen in a while. With Ken Dorsey now as the offensive coordinator for this Buffalo Bills team, look, we know exactly how it works for a lot of quarterbacks throughout NFL history. You have a revolving door at offensive coordinator or at head coach. It could be something that really hurts your development as a offensive player and as a quarterback. Now, the good thing for Josh Allen is Ken Dorsey has been around with the Buffalo Bills since 2019, basically through Josh Allen's entire career. He's been there with Brian Daboll. I think he knows how to talk to Josh Allen like Brian Daboll knew how to talk to Josh Allen and relay plays, relay calls, relay everything that he needs to his star quarterback. I think Ken Dorsey will be able to supplement for Brian Daboll. But there still is the issue of it's not going to be the same exact thing. And for Josh Allen, his year was great. You look at some of the stats for Josh Allen last year in terms of how he produced. Look, it was really weird for Josh Allen. A majority of his interceptions and a majority of his bad plays came when he had as much time as possible in the pocket, over 2.5 seconds. When you compare that to when he was pressured or when he was blitzed or when he had less than 2.5 seconds to throw the ball, he was one of the better quarterbacks in the league from his numbers. And I think he only had 2 interceptions all year last year when he had less than 2.5 seconds to throw the ball. Another interesting thing with Josh Allen, he's going to be a guy this year who is not just the quarterback for this team. He's going to be a secondary running back for this franchise. And we haven't seen it hurt Buffalo yet. But, knock on wood, I hope it never happens. But just with the way Josh Allen plays, the same way it happened to Lamar Jackson last year, the same way it's happened to many other quarterbacks in NFL history, having your guy run as much as Josh Allen does is never going to be the best recipe for success. So let's talk about next season from a record standpoint. Look, it seems like every time I do one of these videos, I say the exact same thing, but the Buffalo Bills have a tough schedule this year. You talk about their first 6 games, 4 of them are on the road, and 4 of them are against teams in the LA Rams, the Miami Dolphins, Baltimore Ravens, and Kansas City Chiefs, who are all gunning to try to get into the playoffs this year. And then their 2 home games are no snuff either. They got the Tennessee Titans in week 2, Pittsburgh Steelers in week 5, 2 teams who, like those other 4 I just said, are going to be gunning for playoff positioning early in the year. They have a bye week in week 7, which, however you want to think about bye weeks, whether you want them earlier or want them later, I would prefer them to be around like the week 10 or 11 mark, so you can kind of have like 2 halves to your season. That's just me. Having a bye week in week 7 is kind of detrimental to this team because they're going to have to play upwards, if they get to the playoffs, 12 games every week, and it's just going to be something that wears and tears on this team. Especially you look at the schedule in the second half of the year, it's not the most terrible schedule to go against. You have 2 games against the Jets, you have a game in Detroit, you have a game in Chicago, host the Miami Dolphins, host the New England Patriots, host the Cleveland Browns, host the Minnesota Vikings. In terms of a record for this team, I could see them getting back to the exact same record as they were last year. I wouldn't call it their floor or ceiling to have an 11-6 record. I think honestly the floor for this team could be a 9-8 record. I really do. With the improvement in this division, with the improvement in the conference in general, there's going to be a lot of teams who are trying to get playoff positioning. And when you play 17 games in a year, you're going to play 10 or 11 games where you're probably playing some really competitive teams, and you'd be lucky to even split those games. And then in those 5 or 6 other games where you're playing not so great competition, you almost have to win. And I hate when teams are in positions where they have to win, or it's like if we lose, that's like the end of the world. And Buffalo had a couple of those games last year. The 6-9 loss in Jacksonville last year, where I think it was Jacksonville's first win of the season in week 8 or 9. Like, that was one of those losses where you look back for Buffalo and you're like, man, not only how do we lose that game, but like, does that affect our mindset for the rest of the season? Those are the kinds of losses that can completely derail a season for a championship contender. Now, I'm in no way saying that happened after the Jacksonville game last year, but I'm just saying, like, those kinds of losses are the kinds of losses that you never want to have. So a floor of 9-8 is probably what this team is the least capable of attaining. I would say 12-5 is probably the best record I could see this team getting to. They did address a lot of the major holes on this team last year. Their main sack guy, Mario Addison, who left in free agency this year, they replaced him with Von Miller, and that was going to be an upgrade whether Mario Addison stayed or not, because their number 1 sack guy last year, and Mario Addison, had 7 sacks. They'll have Gregory Rousseau, who hopefully takes that next step as a secondary pass rusher for this team. Greg Rousseau had a couple of games last year where he looked really, really good as a defensive end, and I really hope he continues his trajectory. I hope Tre'Davious White comes back and is one of the best cornerbacks in the league again. I think Tre'Davious White has a chance by the end of this year to win Comeback Player of the Year if he has that kind of season. And if he leads the Buffalo Bills to have a great defense, a defense who was number 1 in the league in terms of scoring without him last year, this team could be one of those teams that we're considering Super Bowl contenders by the time playoffs come around. So obviously they're going to make the playoffs. Obviously they're going to be one of those teams. Are they going to win the division? It's going to be really tough to win the division against the New England Patriots. And now with the Miami Dolphins, with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle on the same offense, look, I hate to make it seem like it's just two guys that can make an offense go, but when I talk about the Miami Dolphins in a few videos, I'm going to explain to you just how crazy it's going to be to see Waddle, an offense with Waddle, Hill, Gesicki, and hopefully still accurate Tua Tagovailoa. That team in Miami is going to be really good offensively. It's going to be really tough for Buffalo to win their division. I think they still win the division. I think, bare minimum, they make the divisional round and face one of the other three top teams in the AFC. A Super Bowl, though, I just still don't see it. You know, I understand that LA won the Super Bowl last year without really any semblance of a running game. And even though the Cincinnati Bengals did have a running back in Joe Mixon last year, they didn't use him at all really in the Super Bowl, and they almost won. So I'd hate to make it seem like, oh, if you don't have a running back, you can't come close to winning a Super Bowl. But look, last year was a complete anomaly that either team could have won the Super Bowl without relying on the running game ever. And I think for Buffalo, it's going to be tough playing in a cold weather environment week in and week out late in the season and have to rely on Josh Allen to throw the ball 30 to 40 times a game and think it's going to win a Super Bowl.